Hi everyone, welcome back to Chapter 5. In this video, we're going to start talking about some of the practical applications of using classical conditioning. Now, I talked about before multiple different ways classical conditioning is used, such as the developments of fears and phobias, of taste aversions, and then how we use it in the laboratory. But for this, we're going to really focus on kind of the fears and the phobias. That's really one of the biggest ways we use classical conditioning, both to kind of cause phobias, but also how to treat them. So the key thing is really understanding phobias. So what are phobias? So phobias is an irrational fear of something. And most phobias are developed via some sort of classical conditioning. Now, not all of them are, but some are. And most of are. Now, I'm personally scared of spiders. I don't have a phobia. I'm not a fan. But I just thought this was a cute thing. If you have a phobia of spiders, then, you're going to act in an extreme manner. So whereas I might just be like at the heebie-jeebies, if I can't see the spider anymore, I'm like, okay, well, it's fine. Whereas if someone has a phobia of spiders, they're going to refuse to really be in their room until they know the spider is gone. Okay, so it's really important to then understand, well, how are phobias developed? Because how are you supposed to treat something if you don't know how it came about? And so that led to some early research into trying to understand how phobias are formed. And there's a very famous study with this baby called Little Albert. Not ethical anymore. This would not happen anymore. But it's a very famous study that did happen. They did have his parents' permission. And what they did was they looked at conditioning of him to be scared of a white rat. Now, it wasn't just classical conditioning, but it's also what's called conditioned emotional responses. So it's an emotional response to a stimulus that's acquired through classical conditioning, or also called respondent conditioning. So in conditioned emotional responses, then some types of conditioned responses are produced through classical conditioning. And so in 1920, then two researchers, Watson and Rayner, decided to do a study to look at conditioned fear in a young child. And they picked this young baby called Albert. That's what he was known as. That might not have actually been his name, but they always refer to him as Albert. And he was actually chosen because he was a very curious baby. He didn't seem to have any pre-existing fears. So they wanted to see, well, how can we condition him to have these fears? So something that's not a natural fear for him. So originally, he was presented with a white lab rat, and he didn't cry, he didn't try to get away, he actually enjoyed the rat. So here's a picture drawing of him with a rat. He's very interested. He's like, ooh, a fun rat, how fun. Had no fear. But then, during conditioning, then the researchers paired seeing a white rat, really any rat, but usually a white rat. They paired it with the slamming of a hammer on metal, which causes a very loud, startling noise. I live next to construction. I hear hammers on metal all the time. It's very loud. It's very annoying, especially at 7 a.m. But imagine you're a young baby who hasn't heard that before. It's going to be very startling, very scary. They're going to cry. They're going to have a negative response. They're going to try to get away. So the NS, neutral stimulus, was the white rat. it was paired with the US of the slamming of the hammer and the conditioned response. The UR, then, the unconditioned response to that slamming of a hammer would be to cry and try to get away. Now, over conditioning, then the rat becomes our CS after multiple pairing. So now the site of the rat is going to elicit our conditioned response. And it's not just any conditioned response, it's a conditioned emotional response. So you might think of it as a CER. That's what that stands for, is a conditioned emotional response. And so now a white rat, for little Albert, is associated with fear. He cries, he tries to get away. He no longer likes his little friend, the white rat. And it actually got to the point where he generalized his fear of the conditioned stimulus of the white rat to other white fluffy things. So these white fluffy things that he's generalized to is like a white teddy bear that he may have had at home, men with white beards, including Santa Claus. He had all of this fear to the generalized stimuli of any white fluffy thing. So that's the experiment with little Albert. So they showed that you could condition an emotional response. Now, some of you may ask, what happened to little Albert? Did they just leave him like that? Yes, they did. They didn't do any extinction trials or anything to help him. They kind of just left him like that. There's some rumors out there that he went on and died at a young age. That's not true. He actually probably lived a long life. But because we don't actually know his real name, then obviously they stopped following him after a few years, where they just looked at, is there still long-term conditioned emotional response? And I believe they looked at him like a year, 2 years after, and he did still have a fear of white rats and some white fluffy things, because he never went through that extinction trials. Okay? So you can see why it's unethical, but it's a good study. Now, talking about conditioned and emotional responses, it is important to note that they can be either positive or negative. So obviously in little Albert's case, it was negative. So a negative CER would be anger, disgust, prejudice, fear. But you can have some positive CERs as well. So you can condition people to have positive emotional responses. So a pleasant feeling when they see things, happiness, love. For example, if your grandmother's perfume is associated with your loving grandmother who you love so much, then whenever you smell something similar, then it'll elicit a positive conditioned emotional response. Now, it's not very measurable, but you might feel it a little. It might show a little bit of a measurement through skin temperature or heart rate. But in general, CERs aren't something you really measure as easily as, well, positive ones you can't measure as easily as negative, just because it's a lot easier to measure fear than happiness. So that's a conditioned emotional response. Now, there are additional factors in phobic conditioning, so not just conditioned emotional responses. There's obviously questions of, well, why do some people get phobias but not others? And then in people, then in like an individual, then why do some stimuli develop a phobia but not others? So this has to do with who the person is, their background, a lot of different factors that we're going to go through. Now, the first thing is that a lot of phobias are actually developed through observation learning, not through classical conditioning necessarily. So if you see others are scared, then you may also develop a similar fear to them. This is very impactful on children. So for instance, when I was younger, my family, we used to go camping a lot, and my mom has a phobia of snakes. Now, the first few times I saw snakes, it was just with my sister. I thought they were super cool. We picked them up. They were just garden snakes in Minnesota. They were fun. But then my mom freaked out one day. I saw her freaking out because it's a snake. And then that led me to develop a fear of snakes as well. Now, I don't have a phobia of snakes, but I am now scared of snakes. So I observed the fear. And so how that works, if you want to contribute this to our classical conditioning, then you could say your phobia, so in this instance is snakes, would be my NS, the neutral stimulus. Me observing my mom being scared would be the US, the unconditioned stimulus. And then the learned fear would be my conditioned response. So me being scared is something that I actually learned, and that's the response. Okay? You can see how my unconditioned response wouldn't necessarily be the same as my conditioned response. And so that's why observation learning is a bit different than classical conditioning. But it's very important that, a lot of times if your parents are scared of something and you also are scared of something, it's probably because you observed them being scared and not because you had a personal experience with that thing. Now, another thing that could determine whether or not you're going to develop a phobia would be your temperament. So personality actually plays a huge role in who develops a phobia or a fear. So people that are more kind of hesitant of certain things tend to be more withdrawn. So you can kind of think of it like introverts versus extroverts, that an introvert would be more likely to develop a phobia than an extrovert. And someone with one phobia would be more likely to develop more phobias because of their temperament, just that personality, how they kind of act in situations. So if you're more hesitant to go out and explore the world, a new thing's going to scare you more than if you're really excited and you go out and see things. Now, another thing is your preparedness. So again, kind of think of someone's personality. So here we're talking not about introverts, extroverts, but more about Debbie Downers versus Happy Harpers. So someone that's like a pessimist and they always see things negative, so glass half full, that kind of thing, then they're going to be more likely to make a negative connotation with something rather than a positive connotation. And so someone that always seems to make these negative connotations is actually more susceptible to developing phobias than someone that's more optimistic and makes more optimistic connotations, more positive connotations with stuff. So a great example is if I were to say the word red, I want you guys to write down what the first word that pops into your mind is. Okay, so red. Now, based on your answer, it's going to show if you're going to be more or less susceptible to phobias. So when I say the word red, if the first thing you think of is love, that's a positive connotation. But if the first thing you think of is blood, that's going to be more negative. So those of you that answered blood would be more susceptible to phobias than those of you that said love. That's the idea. And then this is just a great gif of the Debbie Downer sketch on SNL. If you haven't seen them, they're hilarious. There's multiples. You should definitely look them up if you need a study break. SNL's great. Okay, so that's preparedness. Another thing that can affect whether or not you develop phobias would be incubation. So incubation is the strengthening of a conditioned fear stimulus as a result of brief exposure to aversive conditioned stimuli. So in other words, you kind of are responsible for your own phobias. So if you're, say, afraid of snakes because you had one experience with a big scary snake once, and then for the next 10 years you avoid anything with snakes, lizards, anything like that. You're just going to avoid all of it. You're going to strengthen that fear of snakes because you're not allowing yourself to be exposed to your conditioned stimulus. Because remember, that's how extinction works, is we get repeated exposure to the CS without the US. So by avoiding your fears, you're actually making your fears worse and allowing them to continue. And this is actually just a natural human process, is we avoid the feared stimulus. But it's actually, kind of harmful because then we can't get rid of these fears. So if you have a fear, try facing it head on. I bet you'll get rid of it or at least lessen the fear a little bit, especially if it's in a controlled setting. And then, of course, there's your US revaluation. So we talked about this in more detail in Chapter 4, but this is where we're changing the value of that US. So again, think about that equation that we talked about with the Rescorla-Wagner theory, where your US has a value, or we had talked about it as a magnitude. So if we change the magnitude of the value, then that can actually change whether something's a fear or a phobia, or if something's from a phobia down to just a fear. A lot of times when US revaluation occurs, it's actually because the first time you experience something, it might just be slightly uncomfortable, and then something's going to happen after this conditioning, so after the NS, or the conditioned stimulus, is associated with the US. So afterwards, then something with the US is going to happen. And so next time the conditioned stimulus is presented, you're going to kind of react differently, usually in a greater magnitude. Now, this can actually happen through direct classical conditioning or through observational learning. So your textbook has the example of that after a traumatic event, so say, in your textbook, there's the example of someone breaks into your house, you call 911, they come, they catch it. The traumatic experience was someone broke into your house, but you're okay, everything's great. But then afterwards, someone tells you, oh, well, the guy that broke into your house is a murderer. Then what's going to happen is your fear of the situation is actually going to get bigger. Because before, then, someone was just breaking into your house. It was just a robbery. But now in your mind, it goes from just a robbery to, say, attempted murder. And that's a lot more serious. So now your conditioned stimulus, which maybe is your house, before your house was associated with a break-in, well, now it's associated with attempted murder. So you're going to have a greater fear response to your house now because someone told you that. And this is why debriefing after traumatic events is so important. Now, there's other ways that this happens that's less dramatic. So for me, I think about, so I grew up swimming in a bunch of lakes in Minnesota, and there's all that seaweed on the bottom of the lake. And when you're swimming, sometimes it touches your foot, and it's weird. It's gross. You don't like it. So growing up, then I just didn't like seaweed touching my feet in the pool. Or, sorry, not the pool, in the lake. But then I started watching documentaries about sharks and stuff, and I associated water, open water, with sharks. So now when I feel the seaweed touch my foot, my mind freaks out even more because now open water, the US, is more associated with the fear of like something more severe. So before, open water was just associated with like seaweed, not a big deal. But now open water, I have a bigger fear because of sharks. So now when I touch the seaweed, I'm going to have a bigger fear reaction than before. Hope that makes sense. Try to come up with your own example. Okay. And then kind of the last thing that can affect your phobias, how they're developed, would be selective sensitization. And this is where minor fears and phobias can then turn more serious due to a stressful event. So I created this fun diagram. I had a good time making it. So here we've got a little cloud. You know, it's like bluish gray. It's fine. Where, you know, you've got a distaste for spiders. You're not necessarily scared of them, but, you know, you'd rather they weren't around, but if they are around, okay. But then something stressful in your life occurs. So maybe you get a divorce. Maybe you lost your job. Maybe you got sick. Something that causes extreme stress in your life will take this mild distaste for spiders and turn it into a full-blown phobia of spiders. Turns this cute little blue cloud into this dark, menacing, giant gray cloud of spiders. Okay, so you can see how a mild distaste can turn into a full-blown phobia because of some sort of life stress. In your textbook, they gave a great example of, someone gets, isn't a huge fan of driving, but they can drive, it's fine. But then she gets a divorce, and now she has a phobia of driving. She has a panic attack every time she drives, because this stressful event that's not related to the phobia at all, but it just kind of, a stressful event in your life can kind of blow things out of proportion. So that's selective sensitization. So we'll end this video here, and then in the next video, we'll talk about how we can treat phobias.